When I saw my own necklace around another woman's neck in my son's family portrait, my world shattered. But when I asked who she was, his response made my blood run cold. "Mom, that's your key." And then he stopped speaking. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The silence that followed those unfinished words felt like a lifetime. I stood there in my son's beautiful new home, staring at that portrait on his mantle, watching my entire world crumble in slow motion. The emerald necklace that had been in my family for 3 generations was gleaming around a stranger's neck, and the man I had sacrificed everything for couldn't even finish his sentence. My name is Margaret, and at 67 years old, I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like. I was wrong. When my husband Robert passed away 5 years ago after 35 years of marriage, I believed that was the deepest pain I would ever experience. But standing in that living room, looking at proof that my only child had erased me from his life, I discovered there are wounds that cut deeper than death itself. You see, I'm the kind of mother who never learned how to put herself first. From the moment David was born, every decision I made revolved around his happiness and success. When he was 8 and wanted piano lessons we couldn't afford, I took on weekend cleaning jobs. When he was 16 and his friends had cars while he rode the bus, I sold my wedding ring to buy him a used Honda. When he graduated high school and got into college, I worked double shifts at the diner for 4 years, just to keep him debt-free. After Robert died, David became my entire universe. I sold the house Robert and I had built together, the one where David took his first steps and lost his first tooth because my son needed money to start his marketing business. I handed him the check for $200,000 without hesitation, telling myself that his success was my success. When he asked for my grandmother's emerald necklace, the only valuable thing I had left, I placed it in his hands with tears of joy, believing he would keep it safe for his future family. I moved into a cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, furnished it with second-hand furniture, and took a part-time job at Morrison's Grocery, even though my arthritis made standing for hours painful. But I never complained, not once. Every evening, I would call David to hear about his day, living vicariously through his achievements. When he told me about buying his first house, I cried tears of pride, knowing that my sacrifices had given him the life he deserved. At the community center where I volunteered, I was known as David's mom. I would show pictures of him in his business suits and tell anyone who would listen about my successful son. The other ladies would share stories about their grandchildren, and I would smile and nod secretly, hoping that someday I would have grandbabies to spoil. I dreamed of holidays where David would bring his future family to my little apartment, and I would cook his favorite meals while his children played at my feet. I was the mother who believed that love meant giving everything and expecting nothing in return. I was the woman who raised a son to be strong, successful, and independent, never imagining that he would use that strength to cut me out of his life completely. But as I stood there that day, staring at that portrait, I had no idea that my real education in heartbreak was just beginning. Before everything fell apart, my days had a peaceful rhythm that I had grown to cherish. Each morning at 6:30, I would wake up in my small apartment and make myself a single cup of coffee using the chipped mug David had made me in elementary school pottery class. The handle was crooked, and it leaked slightly, but it was my most treasured possession because his little hands had shaped it with love. I would sit by the window that overlooked the small courtyard, watching the sun filter through the leaves of the old oak tree while I sipped my coffee. The apartment wasn't much: a tiny kitchen that barely fit one person, a living room with my secondhand couch and Robert's old recliner, and a bedroom just big enough for the bed we had shared for 30 years. But it was clean, and I had made it home with the few family photos I had left and the quilt my mother had sewn for my wedding. After breakfast, I would tend to my little container garden on the fire escape. 3 tomato plants, some herbs, and a small rose bush that I had rescued from our old house before selling it. Gardening reminded me of Robert, who used to joke that I could make anything grow with enough love and stubborn determination. The neighbors below sometimes complained about me watering the plants, but seeing those tiny green leaves reach toward the sun gave me hope that beautiful things could still flourish in small spaces. Most afternoons, I walked to Morrison's grocery, where I worked part-time. The manager, Mrs. Chen, was kind enough to let me sit on a stool during slow periods because she knew about my arthritis. I would scan barcodes and bag groceries, chatting with regular customers who had become like extended family. Mrs. Rodriguez would show me pictures of her new granddaughter, and Mr. Thompson would update me on his son's military deployment. They would always ask about David, and I would beam with pride as I told them about his successful business and his beautiful new house. Tuesday evenings were special because that's when I volunteered at the community center, helping serve dinner to families who were struggling. It reminded me of my own difficult years when David was young, and I found deep satisfaction in being able to help others the way I wished someone had helped me back then. The other volunteers knew my story, how I had sacrificed everything for my son's success, and they treated me with a respect that made me feel valuable despite my humble circumstances. But the highlight of every single day was my evening phone call with David. At exactly 7 o'clock, I would dial his number and settle into Robert's old recliner with anticipation. David would tell me about his marketing campaigns, his difficult clients, and his business victories. I would listen to every word, asking questions and offering encouragement, living through his achievements as if they were my own. When he told me he had finally saved enough to buy a house, I actually danced around my tiny apartment, so proud that my sacrifices had helped make his dream possible. On weekends, I would visit the small cemetery where Robert was buried, bringing fresh flowers and updating him on David's progress. I would sit beside his headstone and tell him how our boy had grown into such a successful man, how all our hard work and sacrifice had been worth it. Sometimes I would wonder aloud when David might settle down and give us grandchildren, imagining how Robert would have spoiled them rotten. My life was simple, quiet, and built entirely around my love for the son I had raised to be everything I never could be. Retrime. The first sign that something was changing came during our Tuesday evening phone call in late March. I had been looking forward to it all day, especially because I had exciting news to share. Mrs. Chen had given me a small raise at the grocery store, and I wanted David to know that his old mom was still making her own way in the world. When he answered, something in his voice was different. The warmth that usually filled our conversations seemed muted, replaced by a distracted tone that made me feel like I was interrupting something important. "Hey, Mom," he said, but it sounded rushed, almost mechanical. "David, honey, you'll never guess what happened today," I started, settling into Robert's recliner with my usual enthusiasm. Mrs. Chen called me into her office and I thought I was in trouble, but she gave me a raise, 25 cents more per hour. I know it's not much, but "That's great, Mom," he interrupted, which wasn't like him at all. David had always been a good listener, asking follow-up questions about my work and the people I met. "Listen, I'm really swamped tonight. Can we keep this short?" The words hit me like a cold splash of water. In 5 years of evening phone calls, he had never asked to keep our conversation short. Even during his busiest periods launching the business, he would always make time to hear about my day, to ask about my garden, to check if I needed anything. "Of course, sweetheart," I managed, trying to hide my disappointment. "I just wanted to hear about your new house. How's the settling in going?" Another pause. Longer this time. "It's going fine. Still lots of boxes to unpack. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. I had never owned a house beautiful enough to require weeks of unpacking, never had enough possessions to fill multiple rooms. I had moved my entire life into this small apartment in 2 carloads. "Maybe I could come help you unpack this weekend," I suggested, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I could bring my famous lasagna and we could make a day of it. I'm so excited to see your new place. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a tension I had never heard before. This weekend isn't good, Mom. I'm having some work done on the place. Contractors coming in and out. It's really not safe for you to be walking around with all the tools and equipment. I frowned, staring out my window at the oak tree. What kind of work? You just moved in. Just some updates, painting, some electrical stuff. Nothing major, but it's going to take a few more weeks to get everything sorted. Weeks? For painting and electrical work in a house he had supposedly been living in for over a month? Well, maybe the weekend after that, I pressed gently. I really would love to see where you're living, honey. Your first house is such a milestone. Yeah, maybe. Look, Mom, I really do have to go. I have an early client meeting tomorrow, another first. David had never ended our calls abruptly, never seemed eager to hang up. Usually, I was the one who had to remind him it was getting late. Of course, sweetheart. You work so hard. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, Mom. Talk to you next week. The dial tone felt like a door closing. I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, holding the phone and replaying every word of our conversation. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had changed. David was successful now, busy with his new life in his beautiful house. Maybe this was just what growing up looked like. Less time for old mothers and their small-town news about grocery store raises. But deep in my chest, a tiny seed of unease had been planted. Over the following weeks, I became an expert at explaining away every red flag that my heart was desperately trying to show me. When David missed our next Tuesday call entirely, I told myself he was probably working late on an important project. When he called back on Thursday with a rushed apology, claiming he had been in back-to-back meetings, I forced myself to smile through the phone and tell him how proud I was of his dedication. You're becoming such a successful businessman, I said, clutching the phone tighter than necessary. Your father would be so proud to see how hard you're working. Yeah, thanks, Mom. Listen, this week is crazy too. Might have to keep our calls shorter for a while. I nodded even though he couldn't see me, swallowing the disappointment that rose in my throat like bitter medicine. Of course, honey. Success requires sacrifice. I understand that better than anyone. At Morrison's Grocery, I found myself defending David to customers who had noticed my change in demeanor. Mrs. Rodriguez, who always asked about him while buying her weekly groceries, commented that I seemed quieter lately. Is everything all right with your son, dear? She asked, her weathered hands gentle as she placed bananas in her cart. Oh yes, everything's wonderful, I replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. He's just incredibly busy with his new house and his business. You know how it is when young people are building their careers. They get so focused on success that they forget to call their old mothers as often. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded knowingly, but I caught a flicker of concern in her eyes that made my stomach twist. Even at the community center, where I usually bragged about David's achievements, I found myself making excuses. When Mrs. Patterson mentioned that her daughter called her every single day, I jumped in with a defensive explanation. Well, David's business is really taking off. He's working with major clients now, staying late most nights. I'm just so proud that all my sacrifices paid off. Sometimes I think I raised him to be too independent. I laughed, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. The other volunteers exchanged glances that I pretended not to notice. In my apartment, I began rehearsing conversations we hadn't had yet. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I would practice telling David about my day, making my stories shorter and more interesting, trying to figure out how to be the kind of mother who deserved his time. Maybe I had been too needy, too focused on my own loneliness instead of celebrating his success. I started reading business magazines at the library, hoping to better understand his world. When articles mentioned the demanding schedule of entrepreneurs, I felt vindicated. Of course David was busy. He was building an empire with the foundation I had provided. The fact that he had less time for me wasn't personal. It was proof that my sacrifices had worked. When I caught myself staring at the phone during our usual call time, willing it to ring, I would force myself to find something else to do. I reorganized my small closet, watered my plants twice, and started going to bed earlier just to avoid the disappointment of another missed call. "He's not forgetting about you," I would whisper to Robert's photo on my nightstand. "He's just busy living the life we gave him." Isn't that what we wanted? For him to be so successful that he doesn't need us anymore? But even as I spoke those words aloud, trying to convince myself they were true, a cold fear was growing in the pit of my stomach. The fear that maybe, just maybe, David wasn't just busy. Maybe he was pulling away from me on purpose, and I was too afraid to admit it because that would mean everything I had sacrificed had been for nothing. By the third week of April, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. David's calls had become sporadic and brief, lasting barely 5. Minutes before, he found an excuse to hang up. When I suggested visiting his new house again, he always had a new reason why it wasn't a good time. Now it was landscaping work, then plumbing issues, then he was having the floors redone. That Saturday morning, I decided to surprise him with his favorite chocolate chip cookies. It was the same recipe I had used for his birthday every year since he was 7. The one that always made him smile and tell me I was the best mom in the world. Surely if I showed up with warm cookies and a cheerful attitude, we could recapture some of the closeness we used to share. I spent the entire morning in my tiny kitchen, measuring ingredients with the precision of a chemist. My arthritis made rolling the dough painful, but I pushed through, imagining David's face when he opened the door and smelled his childhood favorite. I even used my good Tupperware container, the one I usually saved for special occasions, and tied it with a yellow ribbon I had been saving from last Christmas. The bus ride to his neighborhood took 45 minutes and 2 transfers, but I didn't mind. I spent the journey looking out the window at the gradually improving scenery, the small apartments giving way to modest houses, then to larger homes with manicured lawns. When I finally reached David Street, I felt a surge of pride. My son lived in a beautiful neighborhood with tree-lined sidewalks and houses that looked like they belonged in magazines. His house was even more impressive than I had imagined from his brief descriptions. 2 stories of cream-colored brick with black shutters, a wraparound porch with hanging baskets full of colorful flowers, and a perfectly maintained lawn that spoke of professional landscaping. A silver BMW sat in the driveway alongside a red sedan I didn't recognize. My heart swelled with pride and gratitude that my sacrifices had helped make this possible. As I walked up the front path, I could hear laughter coming from inside, David's deep chuckle mixed with a woman's lighter laugh. He had never mentioned having company, but I smiled, thinking maybe he had finally met someone special. At 67, I had long given up on the idea of grandchildren, but perhaps there was still hope. I was about to knock when I caught a glimpse through the large front window. The curtains were partially open, and I could see into what looked like a beautifully appointed living room. David was there, looking relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen in months. He was sitting on an elegant cream-colored sofa, his arm around a young woman with long auburn hair. But it wasn't the woman that made my blood run cold. It was what she was wearing. Around her neck, catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, was my grandmother's emerald necklace. The same necklace that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. The necklace I had given David just 6 months ago, trusting him to keep it, safe for his future family. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I had to grip the porch railing to steady myself. The woman was beautiful, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of effortless elegance that comes from a lifetime of comfort. She was wearing expensive clothes and my family heirloom as if it had always belonged to her. I stood frozen on the porch, watching my son laugh with this stranger who was wearing my most precious possession. Through the window, I could see them talking intimately, completely at ease with each other in a way that suggested this wasn't a new relationship. My hands shaking, I quietly placed the container of cookies on the doormat, wrote a quick note saying, "From Mom with love," and backed away from the house like a thief retreating from a crime scene. Retry. For 7 agonizing days, I carried the image of that woman wearing my necklace like a weight, pressing down on my chest. I barely slept, barely ate, and found myself staring at the phone countless times, wanting to call David but terrified of what I might discover. The cookies I had left on his doorstep were never mentioned in our brief Wednesday phone call, as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Then on the following Saturday, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment, my heart leaped with hope. Maybe he was finally ready to explain everything. Maybe there was an innocent reason why a stranger was wearing my grandmother's necklace. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded strangely formal, almost rehearsed. "I was wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner tonight. I know I've been putting you off about visiting, but I think it's time you saw the house." The invitation I had been desperately hoping for now filled me with dread. Something about his tone made it clear this wasn't going to be the joyful reunion I had imagined. "Of course, sweetheart," I managed, my voice barely steady. "What time should I come?" 6 o'clock. I'll text you the exact address." That afternoon, I changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on my best dress, a navy blue one I had worn to David's college graduation. I wanted to look respectable when I met whoever was living in my son's house, wearing my jewelry. I arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, clutching a bottle of wine I couldn't afford, and rehearsing questions I was afraid to ask. David answered the door wearing an expression I had never seen before: guilty, nervous, and something else I couldn't identify. Resignation, perhaps. "Hi, Mom. Come in." The house was even more beautiful inside than I had imagined. Hardwood floors gleamed under elegant lighting, and everything looked like it had been professionally decorated. But my eyes went straight to the large fireplace mantel, where a stunning family portrait dominated the space. In the photograph, David stood in a suit, his arm around the same auburn-haired woman I had seen through the window. She was wearing a flowing white dress, and my emerald necklace, smiling radiantly at the camera. But it was the third figure in the portrait that made my knees buckle. A toddler, maybe 18 months old, with David's dark hair and the woman's green eyes. The child was sitting on the woman's lap, chubby hands reaching toward the camera with an innocent smile. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a girlfriend wearing my necklace. This was a family portrait, a complete family that I had never known existed. "Mom," David's voice came from behind me, barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." I turned to face him, and the guilt written across his features told me everything before he spoke a single word. "Who is she?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would destroy me. David's mouth opened and closed several times before he finally found his voice. "Mom, that's your daughter-in-law, Sarah. We've been married for 2 years. And this," he gestured weakly toward the portrait, "this is your grandson, Tommy." The words hit me like physical blows. Married, 2 years. Grandson. All this time, while I had been living alone in my tiny apartment, working at the grocery store and dreaming of the day David might settle down, he'd already built a complete family without me. 2 years? My voice sounded strange, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "You've been married for 2 years and never told me?" David couldn't meet my eyes. "Mom, I can explain. Where are they now?" I interrupted, looking around the beautifully appointed house. "Sarah took Tommy to her parents' house for the weekend. I thought it would be easier to tell you when we were alone." The betrayal was complete. Not only had David hidden his wife and child from me, but he had made sure they wouldn't be here when he finally confessed, as if my presence might contaminate his perfect family. As I stood there in shock, staring at the family portrait that proved my son had been living a complete lie, David began talking faster, as if the words had been building up pressure for 2 years and were finally exploding out of him. "Mom, please sit down. Let me explain everything." But I couldn't sit. I couldn't move. I could only stare at that beautiful house around me, the hardwood floors, the expensive furniture, the professional artwork on the walls, and realize with growing horror that I was looking at my own money transformed into someone else's dream. "This house," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You bought this house with the money from my house, didn't you?" David's silence was answer enough. "The $200,000 I gave you for your business," I continued, my voice growing stronger as the pieces fell into place. "How much of that actually went to the business, David?" "Mom, it's not that simple." "How much?" I demanded, turning to face him with a fury I didn't know I possessed. He ran his hands through his hair, the same gesture he'd made as a child when caught in a lie. "About half went to the business. The other half was the down payment on this house. But Mom, you have to understand, I needed somewhere stable to live to make the business work." "And my necklace," I interrupted, pointing at the portrait where it gleamed around Sarah's neck. "The necklace that belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before that? You told me you were keeping it safe for your future family." "I did keep it safe," he said defensively. "I gave it to Sarah when I proposed. It is for my family." The casual way he said it, as if I wasn't his family, as if the 3 generations of women who had worn that necklace before Sarah meant nothing, sent a chill through my entire body. "David, I don't understand. Why couldn't you tell me you were getting married? Why couldn't I meet Sarah? Why couldn't I know about my grandson?" For the first time since I'd arrived, David looked directly at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my legs finally give out. I sank onto his expensive couch, the one bought with my house money, and waited for the final blow. "Mom, Sarah comes from a very different background than us. Her father owns 3 restaurants. Her mother runs a charity foundation. When I met her family, they were so sophisticated. They have these dinner parties where everyone talks about business and politics and travel. They spend holidays in the Hamptons and take vacations to Europe." Each word was a knife twisting deeper into my heart, but I forced myself to listen. "I told them my mother had passed away when I was young," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I said I was raised by my father, who died recently. It just seemed easier than explaining about the diner jobs and the grocery store work and the tiny apartment. Sarah's family is so generous and welcoming, but they have certain expectations about the kind of people they associate with." The room spun around me as I processed what he was saying. My son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, was ashamed of me. Ashamed of the life we had lived, ashamed of the sacrifices I had made to give him opportunities, ashamed of the mother who had worked double shifts and sold her wedding ring so he could have a better life. "You told them I was dead," I said, my voice hollow. "Mom, I never meant for it to go this far." It started as a small lie, and then Sarah got pregnant, and her family was so excited about the baby, and I couldn't figure out how to take it back without losing everything. Everything. His wife, his house, his new family, his place in their sophisticated world, everything except the mother who had given him his life in the first place. I don't remember how I got home that night. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment, still wearing my navy blue dress, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. The container of cookies I had made for David sat untouched on my kitchen counter, a cruel reminder of how naive I had been just hours earlier. For 3 days, I didn't leave my apartment. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function beyond the basic act of breathing. I sat in Robert's old recliner, clutching the chipped coffee mug David had made me in elementary school, and felt my heart break over and over again with each new realization. My grandson, a beautiful little boy with David's dark hair, thought his grandmother was dead. For 18 months, I had missed every milestone. His first steps, his first words, his first birthday. While I was volunteering at the community center, telling strangers about my successful son, my own grandchild was learning to walk in a house bought with my money, surrounded by people who believed I didn't exist. I pulled out the photo albums I kept in my bedroom closet, the ones filled with pictures of David from birth to college graduation. Here was David at 3, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing the Halloween costume I had sewn by hand because we couldn't afford a store-bought one. Here he was at 8, proudly displaying the science fair trophy he'd won with the volcano project we'd worked on together for weeks. Here was his high school graduation, where he had thanked me in his valedictorian speech for being the strongest woman I know. What had happened to that little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms? What had happened to the teenager who would spend hours telling me about his dreams while I helped him with homework at our small kitchen table? When had I become someone he was ashamed of instead of proud of? I remembered the night when he was 16 and had come home crying because some kids at school had made fun of his secondhand clothes. I had held him while he sobbed, promising him that someday he would have everything he wanted, that my sacrifices would give him a better life. I had meant every word, but I never imagined that a better life would mean a life without me in it. The irony was devastating. Every sacrifice I had made, every extra shift I had worked, every dollar I had saved, it had all been to ensure David would never be ashamed of his circumstances. Yet my very existence, the life I had lived to give him opportunities, had become his source of shame. I thought about Sarah, beautiful and sophisticated, wearing my grandmother's necklace like it had always belonged to her. Did she ever wonder about David's mother? Did she ever ask to see photos or hear stories? Or had David constructed such a complete fiction that she never questioned his manufactured past? And what about their dinner parties and Hampton vacations and European trips? Were these the sophisticated conversations David had always longed for? Had our evenings together, me listening to his dreams while washing dishes, him helping me balance my checkbook on the kitchen table, been just painful reminders of the simple life he wanted to escape? On the third night, I found myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror, looking at the face that had become a source of shame for my own child. I saw the lines that came from years of working multiple jobs, the clothes that came from thrift stores and clearance racks, the hands that were rough from cleaning and cooking and sacrificing. "You did this to yourself," I whispered to my reflection. "You made yourself so small, so humble, so forgettable that even your own son could erase you." But then I heard Robert's voice in my memory, as clear as if he were standing behind me. "Maggie, never let anyone treat you like you're worth less than you are." Retrime. On the fourth morning, I woke up on the bathroom floor where I had collapsed the night before, my cheek pressed against the cold tiles, Robert's old bathrobe wrapped around me like a shield. Sunlight was streaming through the small window, hitting my face with a warmth I hadn't felt in days. For a moment, I couldn't remember why I was there. And then the crushing weight of David's betrayal came flooding back. But something was different this morning. Instead of the overwhelming despair that had consumed me for 3 days, I felt something else rising in my chest. A white-hot anger that burned away the tears and cleared my mind with startling clarity. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting from sleeping on the hard floor, and looked at myself in the mirror. My gray hair was disheveled, my eyes were red and swollen, and my face looked older than my 67 years. But for the first time in days, I really saw myself. Not through David's ashamed eyes, but through my own. I saw a woman who had worked 3 jobs to put her son through college without debt. I saw hands that had sewn Halloween costumes and packed countless lunches and held a fevering child through long nights. I saw the face of someone who had given everything she had to raise a good man, who had sacrificed her own dreams so her child could have his. "You are not dead," I said to my reflection, my voice hoarse but steady. "You are not nothing. You are not something to be ashamed of." I walked to my kitchen and made coffee in David's crooked pottery mug, the one I had treasured for decades. As I held it, I remembered the day he brought it home from school, so proud of his creation, insisting it was the most beautiful mug in the world because he had made it for the most beautiful mom in the world. That little boy still existed somewhere inside the man who had erased me from his life, and I was going to find him. I pulled out a notebook and began making a list. At the top, I wrote, "Things David doesn't want Sarah's family to know." Below that, I started writing down every memory, every sacrifice, every moment of love that had shaped his life. The time I sold my wedding ring for his car. The years I worked double shifts for his college tuition. The house I sold to fund his dreams. The necklace I gave him as a family treasure. Then I started a second list. What I deserved to know about my grandson. His name, Tommy, his birthday, his first words, what made him laugh, whether he looked like David as a baby, whether he had inherited the stubborn streak that ran through 3 generations of our family. As I wrote, I felt Robert's presence beside me, and I could almost hear his voice. "That's my Maggie. Don't let them count you out yet." By afternoon, I had a third list. People who can help. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store, who had connections throughout the community. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daughter was a paralegal. The volunteers at the community center, who had heard me talk about David for years and knew the truth of my sacrifices. And most importantly, the library computers where I could research Sarah's family and learn everything David didn't want me to know. I showered, put on my best clothes, and looked at myself in the mirror one more time. The woman staring back at me wasn't the defeated, ashamed mother who had left David's house 3 days ago. This was Margaret, grandmother, survivor, and a force that had been quiet for far too long. David had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate deception. He had assumed that because I was humble, I was powerless. Because I was poor, I was worthless. Because I was old, I was finished. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The next morning, I walked into Morrison's grocery with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. Mrs. Chen took one look at my determined expression and immediately asked if everything was all right. Instead of my usual cheerful deflection, I told her the truth. All of it. Her face grew darker with each detail, and by the time I finished, she was shaking her head in disgust. "Margaret, that boy should be ashamed of himself," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "You are good woman, good mother. This is not right." Mrs. Chen made some phone calls, and by noon, I had the name of a family attorney, Elena Vasquez, who specialized in grandparents' rights and elder financial abuse. The consultation fee was more than my weekly grocery budget, but Mrs. Chen insisted on paying it herself, calling it an investment in justice. That afternoon, I sat in Elena's modest office with a folder full of documents I'd been gathering for 24 hours straight. Bank records showing my $200,000 transfer to David. The receipt for my grandmother's emerald necklace, purchased in 1952 and passed down through 3 generations. Photos of David throughout his childhood, proving our relationship. Even report cards and school certificates showing how I had raised him alone after Robert died. "Mrs. Henderson," Elena said, reviewing my paperwork with sharp, intelligent eyes, "you have grounds for both financial restitution and grandparents' rights. More importantly, if your son has been misrepresenting facts to his wife about your existence, we may have leverage for negotiating access to your grandson." My next stop was the library, where I spent hours researching Sarah's family on the public computers. The Washingtons were indeed prominent in the community. Her father, Richard Washington, owned 3 upscale restaurants and was on the board of the Children's Hospital. Her mother, Patricia, ran a foundation that provided scholarships for underprivileged children. They were active in their church, hosted charity events, and appeared regularly in the local society pages. But most importantly, I discovered something David clearly didn't know. Patricia Washington had been raised by her grandmother after her own mother abandoned the family. The foundation she ran was specifically dedicated to helping children from broken homes achieve educational success. This was a woman who understood sacrifice, who valued the kind of love that puts a child's needs above everything else. I also learned that the Washingtons were hosting their 40th wedding anniversary celebration in 2 weeks, a large gathering at David and Sarah's house that would include extended family, business associates, and prominent community members. The local paper had even mentioned it in their society section, describing it as an intimate gathering of 60 guests to celebrate 4 decades of love and commitment, 60 witnesses to whatever truth I chose to reveal. I hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named Frank Morrison, who came recommended by Elena. Within a week, Frank had documented everything: David's business assets, the house purchase records showing my money as the down payment, even photographs of Sarah wearing my necklace at various social events. More importantly, he discovered that David had been telling colleagues at work that he was an orphan who had made it on his own, using his fabricated tragic backstory to gain sympathy and business connections. The final piece of my plan came together when I remembered something from my research. Patricia Washington's foundation held their annual scholarship ceremony every March, honoring mothers who had sacrificed for their children's education. The irony was perfect. David's mother-in-law literally celebrated women like me, while David himself was ashamed of my sacrifices. I spent evenings crafting a photo album that told the real story of David's life. Every sacrifice, every milestone, every moment of love that had shaped him into the man he became. Each page was meticulously documented with dates, places, and context. This wasn't just evidence. It was a testament to a lifetime of devotion that deserved recognition, not erasure. David thought he could make me disappear from his story. Instead, I was about to make sure everyone knew exactly who had written the first chapters of his life. The week leading up to Richard and Patricia Washington's 40th anniversary celebration, I could barely contain the nervous energy coursing through my veins. Every morning I would wake up with my heart pounding, knowing that in just a few days, the elaborate lie that had erased me from my son's life would finally crumble. Frank Morrison called me on Tuesday with his final report. "Margaret, I've got everything you need." His gravelly voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Your son's been busier than a cat covering up on a marble floor telling different stories to different people. His business partners think he's a self-made orphan. His wife's family thinks his mother died when he was young. And his neighbors believe he inherited money from a wealthy aunt. The boys got more stories than a library. I met with Elena Vasquez one last time to review our strategy. She had contacted Sarah Washington directly, not David, and informed her that there were legal questions regarding the ownership of certain family heirlooms and property investments that required clarification. Elena had been deliberately vague, but Sarah had agreed to meet after the anniversary party to clear up any misunderstandings. David apparently knew nothing about this meeting. "The beauty of this approach," Elena explained, "is that we're not ambushing anyone. We're simply providing Sarah with information her husband should have shared with her years ago. How she chooses to handle that information is up to her." On Friday morning, I received an unexpected call from Mrs. Rodriguez at the grocery store. She was breathless with excitement. "Margaret, you'll never believe this. My daughter, Carmen, the paralegal, she's been hired to help serve food at some big anniversary party this weekend. Guess whose house it's at?" My hands started shaking. "David's house?" "That's right. Carmen says it's going to be huge. 60 people, professional catering, even a photographer. The whole neighborhood's talking about it. Margaret, This could be your chance. I hadn't planned on actually attending the party, but Mrs. Rodriguez's call felt like fate intervening. That afternoon, I called Patricia Washington's foundation directly and spoke to her assistant. I explained that I had information about a scholarship recipient that Mrs. Washington might find interesting, a young man whose educational success had been made possible by his mother's extraordinary sacrifices. Could I possibly speak with Mrs. Washington briefly during their celebration? I had something special to share about the power of maternal devotion. The assistant, charmed by my story, promised to mention it to Mrs. Washington and suggested I stop by during the party with my inspirational materials. By Saturday morning, everything was in place. I had my photo album, my documentation, Elena's business card, and a simple blue dress that Robert had always said brought out my eyes. Frank Morrison would be positioned across the street to photograph whatever happened, though he warned me that once I set these wheels in motion, there would be no stopping them. "Margaret," he said seriously, "are you sure you're ready for this? Once that boy's lies come out in front of all those people, his life is going to change forever. His marriage might not survive it." I looked at the wedding photo on my mantle, Robert and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful and ready to face the world together. Then I looked at the empty spaces where David's photos used to hang, the gaps where my grandson's pictures should have been. "Frank," I said, my voice steady and calm, "my life already changed forever when my son decided I was worth less than his reputation. I'm not trying to destroy his marriage. I'm just trying to reclaim my place in my grandson's life. If David's lies can't survive the truth, that's his problem, not mine." Saturday evening was coming, and with it, the moment when David's carefully constructed world would finally meet the reality of the mother he tried to erase. Saturday evening at 6:30, I stood across the street from David's house watching the anniversary celebration unfold like a scene from a movie. Luxury cars lined the street, and through the large windows I could see elegantly dressed guests mingling with champagne glasses, their laughter carrying across the manicured lawn. Professional photographers moved through the crowd, capturing moments of joy and celebration in the house bought with my life savings. I waited until 7:15, when the party was in full swing, before walking up the front path with my photo album tucked under my arm. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my steps were steady. Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter, Carmen, answered the door wearing a crisp catering uniform. "Mrs. Henderson?" she whispered, recognizing me from her mother's descriptions. "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied. Carmen led me through the beautifully appointed house to where Patricia Washington stood near the fireplace, resplendent in a silver dress, accepting congratulations from a small group of guests. I waited until there was a brief lull in conversation before approaching. "Mrs. Washington? I'm Margaret Henderson. I called your foundation about the scholarship story I wanted to share." Patricia turned with the gracious smile of a practiced hostess, but something in my face made her expression grow more attentive. "Of course, dear. What can I tell you?" "Actually," I said, opening my photo album to the first page, "I wanted to tell you about a mother who worked 3 jobs to put her son through college, who sold her house to fund his business, and who gave him her grandmother's emerald necklace as a family treasure." Patricia's eyes followed my gesture to the mantelpiece, where the family portrait dominated the room. In it, Sarah wore my necklace like a crown, beautiful and unknowing. Patricia's face went very still. "I also wanted to tell you about a grandmother who has never met her 18-month-old grandson because her son told his wife that his mother was dead." The conversations around us began to quiet as people sensed something significant happening. David, who had been across the room discussing business with Patricia's husband, looked over and saw me standing there. The color drained from his face so completely I thought he might faint. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking like a teenager's, "what are you doing here?" But I wasn't looking at David. I was watching Patricia Washington's face as understanding dawned. This was a woman who had built her life's work around honoring sacrificial mothers, who had been raised by her own grandmother's love and dedication. "You're David's mother," she said quietly. "His mother, who he told us died when he was young." Sarah appeared at her mother's side, beautiful and confused, wearing my emerald necklace. "David, what's going on? Who is this woman?" The room had gone completely silent now. 60 guests, including business associates, family, friends, and community leaders, were all watching this scene unfold. The photographer, unaware of the drama, continued taking pictures. I opened my photo album to a page showing David at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing a Halloween costume I had sewn by hand. Then to his college graduation, where he had thanked me for being the strongest woman he knew. Then to the receipt for the emerald necklace, dated 1952, with a clear provenance through my family. "Sarah," I said gently, "my name is Margaret Henderson, and I'm David's mother. I'm also your son, Tommy's grandmother, and I've been very much alive while my son built a beautiful life with the money from my house and the necklace from my grandmother." The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Patricia Washington did something that changed everything. She stepped forward, took my hands in hers, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Welcome to our family, Margaret. I think it's time we heard your story." The aftermath of that evening unfolded like dominoes falling in slow motion, each revelation triggering consequences that rippled through David's carefully constructed world. Within 24 hours, Patricia Washington had called an emergency family meeting at her own home, insisting that I be present while David faced the full scope of his deception. Sarah sat across from us in her parents' elegant living room, my emerald necklace conspicuously absent from her throat, her face a mask of betrayal and confusion. She had spent the night at her parents' house with Tommy, refusing to speak to David beyond demanding answers he couldn't provide without destroying himself further. 2 years, Sarah said, her voice hollow. For 2 years you let me mourn a woman who never died. I visited your mother's grave, David. I brought flowers to an empty plot and told your dead mother about her grandson's milestones. David sat slumped in his chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. "Sarah, I never meant for it to go this far. It started as a small lie." "A small lie?" Patricia Washington's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "You accepted our sympathy for being an orphan. You allowed us to include you in our family because we felt sorry for your tragic loss. My foundation exists to honor mothers like Margaret, and you sat through our scholarship ceremonies knowing you had abandoned your own mother for money and status. But it was Richard Washington who delivered the blow that ended David's marriage. A successful businessman himself, he had spent the weekend investigating David's financial history with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how devastating the truth would be. "David, you didn't just lie about your personal life," Richard said, consulting a folder of documents. "You've been telling your business partners that you're a self-made orphan who built his company from nothing. You've used your fabricated tragic backstory to win sympathy contracts and investments. That's fraud, son. Professional and personal fraud." The business relationships that David had cultivated began crumbling within the week. Word spread quickly through their social circle about the lies, and the sympathy that had once worked in his favor turned to disgust. Clients canceled contracts, and business partners distanced themselves from someone who had built his reputation on deception. Sarah filed for separation within 2 weeks, taking Tommy to live with her parents while she processed the magnitude of David's betrayal. But here's where fate revealed its sense of justice. Sarah had always wanted to meet David's mother, had often wished she could ask mothering advice from the woman who had raised the man she loved. Instead of seeing me as an embarrassment, She saw me as the missing piece of her family. "I want Tommy to know his real grandmother," Sarah told me during our first private conversation. "David's shame about your background says everything about him and nothing about you. My own grandmother raised me when my mother couldn't, and she was the most important person in my life." The legal resolution came swiftly. Elena Vasquez successfully argued that David had misappropriated my money under false pretenses, and I was awarded partial ownership of the house. More importantly, I gained legal grandparents' rights to Tommy, ensuring David could never again erase me from my grandson's life. Within 6 months, David lost everything he had valued above his mother: his marriage, his business reputation, his standing in the community, and his place in the Washington family's social circle. He was forced to sell the house and split the proceeds with me, finally repaying some of what he had taken. I used my portion to buy a small cottage just 3 blocks from Sarah's parents' house, where I could be the grandmother Tommy deserved. The boy, who had never known I existed, now spent weekends helping me plant flowers and learning about the great-great-grandmother whose necklace would someday be his to pass on. David moved to another city, starting over with nothing but the education I had sacrificed to give him. 2 years later, I sit in my small garden, behind the cottage I bought with justice, watching my grandson Tommy chase butterflies between the tomato plants. At 3.5, he's discovered the magic of growing things, just like his great-great-grandmother who first planted seeds with love and stubborn determination. His laughter fills the air as he calls out, "Grandma Maggie, look! The butterfly likes your flowers." The emerald necklace rests safely in my jewelry box upstairs, waiting for the day when Tommy is old enough to understand its story. Sarah insisted I keep it, saying it should return to the family line it was meant to follow. "It belongs with the woman who knows its true value," she had said, "not someone who wore it as a trophy." Sarah visits twice a week with Tommy, and we've developed the relationship I always dreamed of having with my daughter-in-law. She asks for advice about raising a strong boy, and I share stories about David's childhood. The good memories, before shame and greed corrupted his heart. We're teaching Tommy that family isn't about money or status, but about love, honesty, and showing up for each other when it matters most. The community center where I volunteer has become a second home for Tommy. He helps me serve meals to struggling families, learning early that we measure our worth not by what we have, but by what we give. The same ladies who once listened to me brag about my successful son now watch me chase my grandson around the playground, and they tell me I look 10 years younger. Patricia Washington and I have become unlikely friends, united by our shared understanding that a mother's love requires no apology. Her foundation now features my story in their annual presentation, not as a tragedy, but as proof that real strength comes from humble sacrifice, and that truth always finds a way to surface. I still work part-time at Morrison's Grocery, but now it's by choice rather than necessity. Mrs. Chen promoted me to training supervisor, saying my experience with difficult situations makes me perfect for helping other employees navigate life's challenges. I've become the grandmother figure for several young workers who don't have family support, teaching them that your worth isn't determined by your circumstances, but by your character. David sends birthday cards to Tommy now, but we haven't spoken directly since that night at the anniversary party. I pray that someday he'll find his way back to the values I raised him with, but I've learned that you can't love someone into being the person you need them to be. You can only love them enough to let them face the consequences of their choices. My cottage is small, but it's filled with the sound of Tommy's laughter, Sarah's questions about family recipes, and the peace that comes from living in truth rather than pretense. The walls are covered with pictures of my grandson's milestones, his first steps, his second birthday, the day he learned to ride a tricycle. These are the moments David's shame cost him, and they can never be recovered. The greatest gift I've received isn't the legal victory or the financial restitution. It's watching my grandson grow up knowing he's loved unconditionally by a grandmother who will never be ashamed of who she is or where she came from. He'll learn that real family stands by you through difficulties, celebrates your victories without jealousy, and never asks you to hide your past to earn their love. Sometimes the people who owe us everything become the ones who try to give us nothing. But when we refuse to accept less than we deserve, when we fight for our place in the story we helped write, truth becomes our strongest ally. What would you do if your own child tried to erase you from their success story? Have you ever had to fight for your worth in your own family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find the courage to reclaim their place. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of resilience and justice.